The auction. The dust of the high plains had a way of settling into everything: boots, coats, even into the cracks of a man's skin. James Colton knew that dust better than most. He had worked the same stretch of land for 20 years, and it had worked him in return. His ranch sat at the edge of Dry Creek, a settlement too small for the maps and too mean to be forgotten. James was a widower. The word had followed him like a shadow since the day Martha died. 3 winters back, fever had taken her quick, leaving him with only the silence of the cabin and the ache of memory. He was 50, tall and broad from years of work, but hollowed inside. Folks said he barely spoke more than a dozen words in a week. He worked his cattle, mended his fences, and kept to himself. But loneliness does strange things to a man. Nights grew longer than the days, and the bed seemed colder no matter how many blankets he threw over himself. That was when he first heard whispers about the auction. It wasn't cattle, nor horses, nor tools. It was women. The railroad had brought more than steel and smoke. It had carried people from across the ocean. Chinese laborers had been shipped like freight, set to work in mines and camps, breaking their backs for pennies. When debts piled high or when men died, the women who came with them, or were brought against their will, were left with nothing. In towns like Dry Creek, nothing meant being sold to the highest bidder. James hadn't planned to go. He told himself he had no business standing among those men, with their jeers and dirty laughter. Yet that morning, he saddled his horse and rode into town. Something had pulled at him, quiet but insistent, like a prayer whispered in the dark. The auction was held behind the saloon, where shadows stretched long and the stench of whiskey clung to the air. A makeshift platform had been built from old planks. A handful of women stood there, their faces pale and eyes downcast. The men gathered around, tossing coins in their palms, spitting tobacco, and trading jokes too cruel to laugh at. "Lot 4, the auctioneer barked. "Chinese girl, 19 maybe 20. Strong hands, good for house or bed. Start the bidding at $2. A hush fell, then murmurs rose. The girl was slight, her black hair falling loose over her shoulders. She wore a faded cotton dress, too thin for the chill. She didn't lift her eyes, not once. "250, someone called. "3, another shouted. 3 going once. James surprised himself. His voice cut through the crowd, rough from disuse. 3. The auctioneer looked down, confused. "We already got 3. James's jaw tightened. "I'll pay 3. Cash. Now." The men laughed. "You ain't raisin' the bid, Colton. You just want her for cheap." But James didn't flinch. He reached into his coat and pulled out 3 silver dollars. The coins glinted under the lantern light as he held them up. "Done," the auctioneer said quickly. Business was business. He shoved the girl off the platform, and she stumbled forward, nearly falling. James caught her by the arm, steadying her. For a heartbeat, her dark eyes met his, wide, frightened, but burning with something deeper. He had expected shame, maybe hatred. Instead, he saw a spark of defiance, like a candle refusing to die. "Take her then," one man sneered. "Let's see how long she lasts on that God-forsaken ranch of yours." The laughter followed him as James led her away. The ride home was quiet. She sat stiff on the saddle behind him, clutching his coat as if it were the only thing tethering her to earth. James tried to think of words to say, but his throat closed. What could he tell her? That he wasn't like the others? That he had no desire to own her? Finally, he said, low and awkward, "You'll be safe with me." She gave no answer. When they reached the ranch, the last of the sun was sinking behind the hills, painting the sky in bruised colors. James swung off his horse and offered his hand. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers small and cold in his calloused palm. Inside the cabin, he lit a lamp. The place was plain but clean: wooden table, 2 chairs, a bed pushed against the far wall. He pulled another quilt from the trunk and laid it out for her. "You can have the bed," he said. "I'll take the floor." Her eyes flicked toward him, startled. She seemed to study his face, searching for the trap in his words. When she found none, her shoulders loosened a little. He gestured toward the kettle. "There's stew left from the morning. I'll warm it." Again, she said nothing. But when he handed her the bowl, she ate slowly, each bite careful, as though she expected it to be snatched away. James watched her in silence. He realized he didn't even know her name. After a long while, she spoke, her voice quiet, heavy with an accent. "Li Mei." James nodded. "Li Mei." He tried the syllables, rolling them on his tongue. "I'm James." Her gaze dropped again, but he thought he saw the faintest flicker of relief. That night, James lay on the floor, staring at the beams overhead. He could hear her breathing softly from the bed. He told himself he had done the decent thing, that no woman deserved to be sold like cattle. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had bought her. The thought gnawed at him. For $3 silver, he had changed her fate, and bound her to his. And he wondered, as sleep pulled him under, whether she would ever forgive him for it. Morning came cold and sharp. James rose early, as always, to tend the cattle. To his surprise, Li Mei followed him outside, her hair tied back with a strip of cloth. She moved with quiet purpose, fetching water, sweeping the porch, as though work steadied her. He tried to tell her she didn't have to, but she only shook her head. "I work," she said simply. So they worked together. The hours passed in silence, broken only by the lowing of cattle and the creak of leather harnesses. It was strange, James thought, how quickly her presence filled the empty spaces of the ranch. By noon, he caught himself watching her as she hung laundry to dry, the wind tugging at her dress. There was grace in her movements, even in simple tasks. For the first time in years, something stirred in him, something warm, dangerous, alive. But the peace didn't last. That afternoon, a rider came up the dirt road. It was Sheriff Tomlin, a man with a belly grown fat on bribes and a mouth that loved trouble. He tipped his hat, though the smile beneath it was cold. "Colton," he drawled, "heard you made a purchase last night." His eyes slid toward Li Mei, narrowing. "Town's talking already. Some folks don't take kindly to your choice." James's jaw hardened. "She's under my roof. That's all anyone needs to know." The sheriff spat tobacco into the dust. "We'll see about that." He rode off, leaving silence in his wake. Li Mei looked at James, her face unreadable. "They hate me," she whispered. James shook his head. "They don't matter." But in his gut, he knew the truth. The town was afire waiting for a spark. And he had just brought the spark home. A fragile bond. The sheriff's words hung over James Colton's ranch like a storm cloud. Though the sun still shone and the cattle still grazed, James felt the weight of unseen eyes. Dry Creek was a town that thrived on gossip, and gossip there spread faster than wildfire in summer grass. Li Mei noticed it too. When she ventured into town with him for supplies, the stares cut sharper than knives. Men muttered slurs under their breath. Women pulled their children close, whispering as though her presence alone might stain them. At the general store, James heard a voice from behind the sacks of flour. "Colton's gone mad. Payin' good money for a heathen girl? That ain't right." Another chuckled. "A fool and his silver soon parted. She won't last a month out there." James's shoulders tensed, but he said nothing. He wasn't a man of words, not when fists or silence did better. He finished his purchases and left, but he could feel Li Mei's small frame trembling beside him. When they reached the ranch, she finally spoke. "Why you buy me?" The question stopped him cold. He had thought it many times himself, in the quiet hours when doubt whispered. He wanted to say he had done it to protect her, that he couldn't stand to see her sold to men who saw her as no more than a body. But the truth was knottier than that. "I didn't buy you," he said slowly. "Not in the way they think. I just couldn't leave you there." Her dark eyes studied him, searching for cracks in his words. At last, she gave the smallest nod. "I believe you." Her story. That night, as the wind rattled the cabin shutters, Li Mei spoke again, her voice fragile yet steady. "I was born in Canton. My father, he died when I was little. My mother sold me to pay debt." James felt the words strike deep. He kept his gaze fixed on the flames in the hearth, not wanting her to see the anger in his eyes. Anger not at her, but at the world that could treat her so cruelly. "They bring me here. Ship, train, walk. Many die. I clean in camps, serve food, sometimes worse. Always worse." Her voice faltered, but she pressed on. "Then men sell me again, in this town." Silence filled the cabin. James's hands curled into fists on his knees. He wanted to reach across the space between them, to promise her that no man would touch her against her will again. But promises were fragile things, and he had made too many in his life that time and fate had broken. Instead, he said, "You're safe here." She glanced at him, a flicker of trust glinting in her eyes. The ranch rhythm. Days fell into rhythm. At dawn, James would ride out to check fences or drive cattle to water. To his surprise, Li Mei insisted on helping. She learned quickly how to carry buckets, how to mend chicken coops, how to knead bread with strong, steady hands. James tried to protest. "You don't need to work." But she shook her head firmly. "Work makes me strong. If I do nothing, I am ghost." So he let her. And in her quiet labor, something shifted in the ranch. Where once the cabin had been only wood and shadow, it now smelled of broth and herbs, sounded of soft humming as she worked. Sometimes, when the sun was setting and she stood by the well with her hair loose and glowing red in the light, James caught himself staring. He would look away quickly, ashamed at the stirring inside him. He was a widower. His heart had died with Martha, or so he had believed. But Li Mei's presence stirred embers he thought long cold. The town turns. One afternoon, James returned from the pasture to find Li Mei pale and shaken. She had gone into town alone to fetch salt. A group of boys had cornered her near the well, mocking her speech, tugging at her sleeve. "They spit," she whispered, eyes shining with unshed tears. "Say I am dog. Say I should go back in cage." James's blood boiled. He saddled his horse and rode into town like a storm. The boys scattered when they saw him coming, but he caught sight of their fathers lounging outside the saloon. "You keep your brats away from my land," James growled, his voice carrying the weight of thunder. One man sneered. "Maybe we wouldn't have to if you didn't bring filth into our town." The crowd laughed, but James didn't. He stepped close enough that the man's smirk faltered. "Next time, it won't be words." The saloon fell quiet. James turned and walked away, but he knew the line had been drawn. The town had marked him as a man against them, and they would not forgive it. A growing bond. That night, Li Mei sat at the table with a candle between them. Her hands trembled slightly as she sewed a tear in his shirt. James watched her, the soft glow catching on her cheekbones, and he realized how small she seemed against the world that hated her. "You shouldn't have gone alone," he said gently. She looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. "I wanted to help. To belong." "You belong here," he said, surprising himself with the force in his voice. Her lips parted slightly, as though the words had touched something tender in her. She lowered her gaze again, but a faint color bloomed in her cheeks. For a long moment, silence stretched, but it wasn't the hollow silence of loneliness. It was something else, something alive, fragile, and dangerous as fire. Rumors of violence. By the week's end, the rumors had hardened into threats. James heard it at the blacksmith's, from a man who owed him no kindness but no harm either. "Colton," the blacksmith muttered under his breath, "you best keep watch. Some folks been drinking heavy and talking heavier. They say a Chinawoman don't belong on white man's land. They say they'll come make it right. James's jaw tightened. He had known trouble was coming, but the nearness of it made his chest ache. He thanked the smith and rode hard for home. That evening, as Li Mei set bowls of stew on the table, James said, "There may be trouble soon." Her hands froze, but she did not ask what kind. She already knew. "Will you send me away?" she asked softly. James looked at her then, truly looked, the courage in her, the scars she carried unseen, the fragile trust she had placed in him. "No," he said. "Not ever." For the first time since she had come to him, Li Mei smiled. It was small, fleeting, but it lit the cabin brighter than the lamplight. And in that moment, James knew he would fight, against the town, against the world itself if need be, to keep her safe. Blood on the wind. The night the town came was colder than most. A stiff wind rattled the shutters, carrying with it the smell of smoke and whiskey from Dry Creek. James Colton had been expecting them for days. Every whisper in town, every hard look, every insult spat at Li Mei had been a warning. He had repaired the fences, checked the rifles, stacked wood by the door. But no amount of preparation could steady the storm gathering inside him. Li Mei moved quietly about the cabin, her hands busy though her eyes betrayed the fear she carried. She set a kettle on the stove, but her fingers trembled against the iron handle. "They are coming, aren't they?" she whispered. James nodded once. "Tonight." She turned to him, her face pale in the lamplight. "They want me. They'll have to go through me first." His words were plain, but they carried the weight of iron. Li Mei stood still for a long moment, then crossed the small room to him. She touched his arm lightly, uncertain, as though afraid he might pull away. "Why? Why risk everything for me?" James's gaze dropped to her hand, so small against his weathered skin. He swallowed hard. "Because you're not theirs to take. And because you matter to me, Li Mei. More than I can say." Her eyes softened, shining with unshed tears. She didn't speak, but the silence between them said enough. The mob arrives. The first sound was hooves, dozens of them, pounding the dirt road. Then came voices, rough and angry, shouting curses into the night. Torches flared against the darkness, a river of fire winding toward the ranch. James stepped outside, rifle in hand. Li Mei stood at the window, watching with her heart in her throat. "Colton!" Sheriff Tomlin's voice bellowed over the crowd. "You got no right keeping a Chinawoman on white man's land. Send her out, and maybe we'll let you be." James raised the rifle, his voice carrying across the night. "She stays. Any man comes through my gate won't walk back out." The mob roared in answer, torches shaking in the air. One man hurled a bottle. It shattered against the porch rail, flames licking the wood. James stamped it out with his boot, his jaw set like stone. "You don't want this fight," he warned. But hate was louder than reason. The first man rushed forward, swinging a club. James fired once, the crack echoing across the valley. The man fell, and silence cut through the mob for a heartbeat, before rage answered with a howl. They surged forward. The fight. James moved like a man possessed, his rifle bucking against his shoulder, each shot deliberate and true. The mob stumbled, some falling, others pressing harder. The air filled with smoke, firelight, and screams. Li Mei grabbed a pistol from the shelf, James's late wife's revolver, and loaded it with shaking hands. She fired through the window, her small frame steady with courage she didn't know she had. A man howled and dropped, clutching his leg. They came in waves, trying to circle the cabin, trying to burn it down. James kicked the door open and charged onto the porch, swinging the rifle like a club when the bullets ran dry. He knocked one man to the dirt, then another, his breath coming hard and fast. "Back!" he roared, his voice carrying above the chaos. But they didn't back. The fire of hate had already consumed them. A torch landed against the side of the cabin, flames licking up the wall. Li Mei rushed out with a bucket, dousing it, coughing against the smoke. A man lunged for her, grabbing her arm. She screamed, but before he could drag her away, James struck him down with the butt of his rifle, fury blazing in his eyes. "No one touches her!" he bellowed. For a moment, the mob faltered. The sheriff, red-faced and sweating, pushed to the front. "He's just one man. Take him." But the men hesitated now. James stood tall on the porch, blood running from a cut above his brow, his rifle raised again. Li Mei stood at his side, pistol steady in her hands. "You'll have to kill us both," James growled. The mob shifted uneasily. Some muttered. Some backed away. For all their hate, few had the stomach to die for it. At last, the sheriff spat in the dirt. "This ain't over, Colton. You'll regret this." He turned his horse, and slowly, grudgingly, the mob drifted back into the night, their torches winking out one by one. Aftermath. When the last hoofbeat faded, silence returned, heavy, broken only by the crackle of dying fire. James lowered his rifle, his chest heaving. His body ached with bruises, but he hardly felt it. Li Mei dropped the pistol, her hands shaking. She swayed, and James caught her, pulling her close. She pressed her face against his chest, and he held her as though he would never let go. "They'll come again," she whispered. "Let them," James said fiercely. "This is our home now, and I won't let anyone take it from us." She looked up at him, her eyes shimmering. "Our home." He hesitated only a heartbeat before nodding. "Ours. If you'll stay." Her lips trembled into a smile, fragile but radiant. "I will." A new dawn. The dawn that followed was quiet. Smoke still curled from the blackened edges of the porch, and the ground bore the scars of violence. But inside the cabin, something new had taken root. James sat at the table, his hand resting over Li Mei's as she poured tea. For the first time in years, he felt the weight in his chest ease. Martha's memory would never leave him, but neither would this woman, this survivor, this fighter, this flame who refused to be extinguished. "You saved me," she said softly. James shook his head. "No, we saved each other." Outside, the sun rose over the hills, casting the ranch in gold. And though the town still simmered with hate, James and Li Mei faced it together, not as master and purchased bride, but as two souls bound by blood, fire, and a love born in the harshest of places. Whatever battles lay ahead, they would face them side by side. And for the first time in years, James Colton dared to believe in tomorrow.